Hello, I'm Dr. Dan Ratner, and I'm here as always with Kasey Scheinwald, also known as Vlad to the Bone, and Ross the Boss.
Hey everybody, I'm Ross the Boss, and I'm excited for baseball season. I don't want to talk about it with you, cowboy.
All right, now if you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below. We'd love to talk to you about all things fantasy sports. All right, guys, we're over a month into the season, and most players have gotten around 100 at-bats or 6 starts in the season, so we have a pretty good idea of who these players are. It's a decent sample size at this point. Many fantasy managers are able to identify their strengths and weaknesses on their team, and now that's the point of this time together. We're going to talk about how you do that. How do you evaluate whether your players are overperforming, underperforming? How do you make the determination to evaluate your team? Kasey, I'll turn to you first.
So I think what you're trying to discover is whether your player at this point in the season is performing the way they are supposed to be or whether they're getting lucky or unlucky. And so I like to look at statistics. I like to look at some of the less obvious statistics. So if, for example, if a batter's batting average is low, now low and depends on what the batting average kind of is for league wide. But let's say you're looking at a batter who typically bats 300 to 310 and is for some reason batting 240. I'm looking for statistics such as batting average on balls in play, whether or not they're making consistent contact and hitting the ball well, but they're just hitting into outs, because somebody who is consistently making strong contact but making outs, eventually their batting average will regress towards the mean. So it could be a positive regression, meaning they're probably getting unlucky at this point. Whereas if their batting average on balls in play is around the same as their batting average, then that's kind of what you're expecting it to be. And so there are statistics you can look at that determine whether or not somebody is getting lucky or unlucky in their performance.
All right, let's move over to Ross just for a second, because you gave us one way of thinking about evaluation. Ross, what would you say is one of your number one evaluators?
I'm not going to do what y'all think I'm going to do. It's just flip out. But before I mosey on out of here, out of this show, there's a few things I want to tell you. Ross,
Great Jerry Maguire.
Yeah.
Great Jerry Maguire reference.
Don't forget the fish.
This fish has more
fish.
manners than Kasey Scheinwald. There's no fish behind me. But what I want to tell you is this. You got to know your player's history. If he's coming from the National League, he's going to the American League, or if he's a rookie coming off a big injury, if he started out this year kind of slow, let's say in April, and now it's like the second or third month of the season, wait on your player. Don't give up on like a big name or a guy that's proven in the past that he's hit really well. And people do that. And what Ross the Boss comes in, he swoops in and gets these players when owners are really down on them. So your weakness, if you have a weakness, you feel like, let's say it's home runs or RBIs, they kind of coincide together. But let's just say it's home runs, and you have a player that's not hitting home runs, but in the past he has hit home runs. Please wait on him, or if you want, trade him to me, and I'll win the league. It's up to you. But you got to be patient. Patience will solve everything, especially in a keeper league. You don't want to give up on your stars. Please, I'm telling you this right now. There's a lot of big names that will start off slow, and there's a whole history about it. I don't have time to talk about it. I can if you want. I love to. But these guys won't give me the time to do it. But be patient, and your strengths will appear after a few weeks.
Okay, so far, Kasey's talked about statistics and some of the
That's boring. Who wants to look at
statistics.
this? Who cares about that?
Hang with me, Ross. And you talked about track record, and I agree with both. And in fact, sometimes you have to match them up to see. I think sometimes you also have to take into account context.
Okay.
Look at the team. Is somebody starting to lose playing time, for example? Somebody you may have drafted highly, if they're not playing that often, it doesn't matter how highly you thought they were going to be rated. If they're not playing, they're not going to rank high. So you really have to understand the team context. Does the manager like them? Are they fitting in? Maybe they did go to a new league and they're not picking up on the new pitchers as well. Look at the team context to see what's real here. And I think ultimately that's what we're talking about, right, Kasey?
Yeah, there's a lot of variables that you have to consider when you're evaluating your roster. Obviously, we all talk about a player's prime is somewhere in their mid to late 20s. After that, once they hit into the 30s and get later on in years, there are certainly your outliers who are going to perform well into their late 30s. And we've seen them throughout the years, but they're rare. And so Ross is right. If somebody has a track record of success and they're still in their prime years, it's a good idea to be patient and wait a little longer. But if somebody's getting into their later years or they're coming off a major injury the year before, maybe patience isn't the key, and it's trying to get value for that player while you still can. It's important to understand the value of your players. The strengths and weaknesses of your roster are great, but when it comes to evaluating how to fix your roster, you have to understand the value of your players, and understanding the nuances that you're referring to are really important.
Now, Ross, you were also making reference essentially to buying low. When you see a player struggling and their track record's good, you go after them. I assume the opposite would then be true, that when you see some player that's going bananas, even if it's on your team, you'd be willing to sell them if you don't think it's going to keep up.
Oh, that's a must. I mean, if a certain player is playing like bananas, like you said, I mean, I'll put offers out there on the player, and because his value is peaking, and that's when you should sell, especially in baseball, where everything kind of evens out at the end of the season. A player won't hit 400. I mean, we won't see another 400 hitter until I don't know when. That's not going to happen. As much as I want it to happen, that's something we'll never see. Ted Williams will have that record for a long time. But that all being said, there's great players that have really bad the first 2 months, and then you pick it up in the summer when it gets hot, they get hot. So you just got to be aware of that. But yes, trade your players if they're really hot, and try to get the guys that are not doing that great, because everything will even out.
All right, guys, now let's talk about team context, meaning your own team. You got to look at your roster and see how it breaks down. You might have great depth at certain positions, and maybe you didn't expect it, and in other positions, not so much. So let's start talking about how to rebalance. When you see that you're out of balance in some way, Kasey, what are some of the things that you do to rebalance, or at least how do you evaluate where do you need to rebalance?
Well, we're at a point in the season where you have a good idea of what categories, if you're in a category league, I'm going to refer to a rotisserie league as opposed to a head-to-head league right now. You have a good idea of what categories your team is going to be strong in versus what categories your team is going to struggle in. And you have a good idea of what positions now where you might have 2 or 3 players who are all contributors, whereas a different position where you thought you had some depth, but either because of injuries or underperformance, suddenly you're struggling. And so it becomes really important to understand not only your roster, but then look at the other rosters. And we'll talk in another video about how to do trades. I don't want to get into that here, but a way to rebalance your roster is to look at where you have strengths and use those strengths to address weaknesses either through the waiver wire or trades. And then to me, it's more important to address the weaknesses really early in the season as opposed to waiting till later in the season. Because, for example, if you're struggling in saves, you can get a closer now who can get you a lot more saves throughout the duration of the season, as opposed to trying to get one for the last 2 months where even the best closers might only help you by a few saves. So now is the time to pounce on what you perceive or what you value as the areas you need to improve, because you have the longest time to catch up or the longest time to build those statistics up for the remainder of the season.
Let me also just throw out there that the longer the season goes, the more clearly the standings take shape. And that makes it actually harder to get certain players from certain people, because everybody knows where they stand, and that can make the cost go way up for the commodity you're looking for. So try to get the commodities earlier. And I like your point about the waiver wire, by the way. A lot of times you got to look on the waiver wire and see where the depth is. So if you want to rebalance, and let's say you're weak at a position, pick up a player off the waiver wire. Maybe it is even at the position of strength, so that you can deal away from the position of strength.
That's smart. And let me tell you, I'll give you an example for this year. I'm not saying the years, so I'm not saying the year.
No,
but
we don't know when this is.
I'm not saying it. But this year, first base has been like a plethora of talent. It's been unbelievable. I mean, there's guys on the first base waiver wire that are hitting like over 300 and are like one of the top leaders in RBIs, and they're on the waiver wire. So that's when you can deal away your first baseman that you have, pick up the guy from waiver wire and get a really good outfielder, let's say third baseman, something that you're weak at. I mean, again, you got to look at your strengths, and the strengths on the waiver wire is first base right now, but it changes. You got to be aware.
changes every year. Now, you do also need to see the standings for yourself, and you got to know how to evaluate the standings. Well, Kasey, what do you look for? Let's take rotisserie first, then we'll deal with head-to-head.
Well, in rotisserie, what I'm looking for is not only where I am in the standings, but how big that gap is between myself and the team below me and myself and the team above me in the standings. Because
and I would say teams, because if
teams,
you can see you can
sure.
move up 4 in
Sure.
one slot, go for it.
If I've built up a big enough cushion in one category where I can sell some of my strengths there and not suffer more than a point or 2 drop, but gain 5 or 6 points in another category through those trades, it becomes even more valuable trade commodities for me in that category. I can give up some of my strength, some of my depth, and make up some on the other side, even if I'm trading a league leader in something. And so understanding not only what your rank is, whether if you're 6th out of 12th, so you have 6 points, but you're 32 RBIs ahead of the person behind you, and getting another 4 saves can gain you 5 points. You might want to trade an RBI guy for a closer to somebody who might be hurting for RBIs. And so it's understanding what the gaps are between where you are and where you want to get to.
This is actually a very important reason we evaluate at this point in the season, because you're starting to see the standings take some kind of shape so you can know how to address them. And you have to know the balance of your team. Now, I'm going to add one other thing, and I want to hear from you on this, Ross, just your opinion. But my feeling is that people also need to take a good look at themselves and the way they're valuing the players. Because we come in thinking all kinds of things about people, and sometimes people don't change that. So if you come in super hot on one guy and he's just not performing and you're not seeing the signs, you're going to keep going down that path. You have to be willing to self-correct and recognize, okay, I overvalued this position, or I overvalued this player, or I undervalued this player, or this player's blowing up on another team and I think it's for real. So, Ross, take us through how you evaluate whether you perceived things correctly or not, or do you just feel you always perceive them correctly?
Well, it's kind of, I mean, now from like 10 years ago, there's so many different stats people have, like ball velocity, exiting the bat. There's so many different stats people have now on ball players that they didn't have even 10 years ago, even 20 years ago. I mean, it's changing every year. There's like a new stat that they want to tell you about a ball player, so you would value them higher on your team or whatever. But I mean, you just got to. I mean, there's luck involved too. There's a thing called injuries that happen on an everyday basis with players, and now with COVID going on, players get 15 days they're on the DL for COVID, and there's other things that happen with injuries. So you got to have a little luck. Little luck is involved with your player, so he stays off the DL and he plays the whole year. I mean, there's players now there's a player now who won the MVP that can't even throw the ball, but he's still playing because he's hitting so well, So there's a lot of factors that you got to determine with your player, with injuries and everything else, and what team he's playing on also, and what ballpark he's playing in. There's a whole bunch of things, but long story short, you got to go with your feeling, what's inside you, nobody else. So you go with your feeling, what you want to do.
Okay, guys, let's talk a little bit about head-to-head. We talked about categories with rotisserie. We're going to finish up on head-to-head. How do you evaluate your team at this point in the season head-to-head? Because you don't have the standings as much. You just have the weekly, results. Kasey, what do you do in head-to-head that's different in evaluating your team?
Well, in head-to-head, I tend to look more at, obviously, recent performance, because you're not looking at a cumulative effect of statistics. So if somebody has struggled for a couple weeks, I'm more likely to sit them instead of allow them to play through a slump, and eventually the statistics will be there at the end of the year. I look for more the hot player and try to play the hot hand all the time. Also, I'm looking at the opponent's roster and seeing where they're strong or they're weak, and looking at their kind of 100 at bats in and what the strengths of their roster are, so I know how better to compete with them on a week-to-week basis. So if I know I'm playing Ross's team and Ross's team is crushing the ball, home runs and RBIs, but their average is low and their pitching statistics are bad, I'm going to look to design my team to just give up a few categories and really attack where I can in terms of beating them. Because if it's a 9 category league, you just want to win 5 of the 9 categories to win that week. So it's not about competing against the entire league and looking at those gaps, but about who's worse than you and who's better than you. It's about looking at the opponent that you're playing that week and understanding what their strengths and weaknesses are, so you can attack their weaknesses and not waste time trying to beat them where they're going to beat you already.
So, Ross, how do you balance your team in head-to-head?
Well, head-to-head, it's a whole different thing. I mean, basically, you're looking at the week, you're looking who's playing who, but also pitching-wise, you want to have that pitcher that has 2 starts. So you want to grab a pitcher that's going to start Monday, then he starts Saturday or Sunday. A lot of teams have 6-man rotations. You want to stay away from those teams, obviously, because you want to get those 2 starts with your good pitcher, but you can also pick a guy up in waiver wire. But, with head-to-head, you start your best guys. I mean, and then you can start as many starts as you want. So if somebody is not playing tonight, let's say, you fill them in, but you got to go on for head-to-head. It's very important that you go on your computer every day and update it, because a lot of stuff happens, and it's very important as a manager, you update your team every day with head-to-head, because if you miss one day, that can cause you the whole week. So
it's really an important point in general to really stay on top of things.
That's like this in fantasy sports in general. You got to be on your computer or your phone, any way you do it, but it's very important that you stay ahead of the game. All
right. Well, we have looked at many different aspects of how to evaluate your team at this point in the season, about a month or so, or maybe 6 weeks in. It's a very important time to do it. Guys, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below, and we'll get back to you personally.